We have a wonderful program this afternoon. We have a short version of the film The Nuns, the Priests, and the Bombs by Helen Young, and the filmmaker is also here with us this afternoon. We're also joined this afternoon by the Kings Bay Plowshares, 4 members of the Kings Bay Plowshares, and we'll hear about their action in Kings Bay and allow that to help us to interpret Helen's film. This afternoon we have Martha Hennessy, Claire Grady, Patrick ONeill, and Carmen Prada. Representing 2 of the defendants who remain in Glynn County Detention Center are Frida Beragon, Liz McAllister's daughter, and Beth Brockman, friend of Steve Kelly. Mark Colville's wife, Luce, was going to join us but was not able to join us this afternoon. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to just take 1 minute to thank all the areas of Fordham University that brought this afternoon together. Fordham's Center on Religion and Culture, the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, our International Humanitarian Affairs Institute, and our Peace and Justice Studies. We're welcoming you this afternoon also on behalf of the New York City and the Ithaca Catholic Workers and Pax Christi Metro New York. So there's many of us who have brought this afternoon into being, but we're hoping that all of us together will really have the opportunity both to engage Helen's film and to hear from our Kings Bay Plowshares defendants. In order to open our program, I'm just going to ask each of the defendants to say a word or 2 about their action as a way of orienting us to the film. So perhaps if Martha, you wanted to begin.
Thank you all for coming, and I would just briefly say that when I went onto the base, I brought we brought Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine. We also brought an indictment that we put on the door of the Strategic Weapons Facility Atlantic. And I was with Claire, and we also put up a crime tape, and it was one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life. It went by very, very quickly, and yet it also took a very long time for us to be arrested. And the man who arrested us was incredibly polite and kind and gentle. And I don't know why I'm telling you this, but this is what is sticking in my mind. And thank you all for being here.
I'm Patrick ONeill. So Jeannine, Fletcher, and Carmen Prada walk into a bar. No, that's not the script. On behalf of Elizabeth McAllister and Father Steve Kelly and Mark Colville, who are not here, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'd like to open with a quote from Pope Francis, which I think is a good one. Weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, create nothing but a false sense of security. They cannot constitute the basis for peaceable coexistence between members of the human family, which must rather be inspired by an ethics of solidarity. In the post-millennial report issued by the UN in 2000, it noted that in the 21st century, 170 million people perished in wars worldwide. That's 1.7 million people a year for 100 years. And more than 90% of those who died were civilians, meaning that the most safe thing to do in war is to be a combatant. In response to the war on terror without end, the 7 of us went to Naval Station Kings Bay on April 4th, the 50th anniversary of the murder of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, citing King's condemnation of the triplets of militarism, racism, and excessive materialism. We used blood, hammers, and scripture, and converted some nuclear swords of mass destruction into agricultural implements, plowshares. We awaited arrest, received Georgia state charges and then federal charges, 6 felonies in total, and were held without the benefit of bail for 7 weeks. Since then, Martha, Claire, Carmen, and I have been released on $50,000 bond and placed on ankle monitors, which we'll be happy to pose with our ankle monitors if you want to take pictures afterwards. and under home confinement and curfews because we, quote, represent a threat to the safety of the community, unquote. Please keep in mind that the Trident II D5 missiles that arm the Kings Bay Trident submarine fleet are arguably the most insidious and evil weapons of mass destruction ever constructed. First strike. At present, the 7 of us are in a lengthy pretrial holding pattern as we await the government's response to our various motions that argue our actions were illegal response to the U.S. deployment of weapons of mass destruction that stand at the ready to bring an end to the human experiment. We and our great team of defense lawyers are arguing our case on the basis of U.S. law, international law, necessity, and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to name a few. In conclusion, the Kings Bay Plowshares argue that these tridents and weapons of mass destruction have no right to exist, that they are an affront to God and to creation, that our nuclear weapons maintain a threat that holds the entire world hostage. As Martin Luther King said, the choice is no longer between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence.
So, yeah, we were asked to share for just a brief moment something that you might ruminate on. Oh, I'm Claire Grady. And one of the things that led me to take this particular Plowshares action sort of in contrast to the one I took in my 20s in the 1980s was not just the fear of if these weapons are launched, but how they kill every day, not just by their mining, the mining, testing, and the storage, the dumping of this radioactive, deadly material, all on native land, but how these weapons are used like the biggest ballistic on the planet. And so for me, that's how these weapons enforce, because they're the capstone of all violence, the Trident particularly, enforces all the systems that the planet is dying of. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King identifies it as racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. And we could use the words, I kind of use the words, white Christian supremacy and global capitalism and militarism. And the planet is literally dying of those triplets together. And so, but it's very rare to see the connection between our militarism and 700 military bases on the planet from the United States, and how this force, this deadly force, is related to enforcing those systems. Thank you.
And I'm Carmen Prada. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. And I've been at the New York Catholic Worker, or the Catholic Worker, for more than 30 years. And in my earliest time, in my first year at the New York Catholic Worker, I met Father Daniel Beragon. And in our earliest conversation, Dan said to me, "You need to meet the real Beragon." And he was talking about his brother Philip. And his brother Philip at that point was engaged in the ongoing Plowshares actions. It would take a very long time for myself, however, to latch on to this. So I was part of 3 prior Plowshares actions and could not go through with it, in large part because of the pain that I felt that my mother would suffer. So that may give you some proof that I'm half Italian, the only one in this group. And then it was years, so I had turned off and just wouldn't do it, because it was a little humiliating not to go forward with some of your friends. And then in the Y12 Plowshares action, I had been asked to join that. And I said no, and it was the first time in a long time that I had been approached again on the topic. And it made me think and reconsider. And then I heard that there was a group gathering. And when I saw who the group were, I could not do it. These are all dear friends. I have no felony charge against me in my life. 5 of my co-defendants already had prior felonies, which meant that which will likely mean that when we go to jail, they will be sentenced more severely than I was. So to walk into the room and to see those friends before me, and to realize the jeopardy that they were in, as I said, I could not do it. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be on the radio.
So I'm Beth Brockman. I'm not a co-defendant in this case. Please don't implicate me in that. But anyway, I'm happy to be here as a stand-in for Steve Kelly, Father Steve Kelly, who's in the Greene County Detention Center as we speak. And I wanted to just start with what he always begins all his correspondence with. And any of you who've ever received a letter or a postcard from Father Steve, a Jesuit priest, will know these words. The peace of Jesus be with you and with all who encounter you and for whom you care to include such peace. And Steve, the other thing about Steve that you should know is that we've been correspondents for many years. Many of those years he's been in prison. And the thing he would always say to me about doing these actions is, the nukes aren't going away by themselves. And for this particular action, I wanted to use some of Steve's words that he used in court about why he went to Kings Bay the day he did. He really feels like that as a Jesuit priest, it's part of his calling to preach the Word of God. And particularly to preach the Word of God in places and to people who are most in need of hearing it. Believing that nuclear weapons are a sin against God, Steve's actions on April 4th were an attempt to act on his religious beliefs and calling for gaining access to both the site of the sin as well as the people who were caught up in the sin. Going onto the base was an integral part of his calling to preach this word in an undiluted way to the various personnel with specialized interest on the base, therefore gaining additional hearers of the word and to reach people that are caught up in something that has gone really wrong, and that there's a way out. We can convert all of this to peaceful and peacetime production.
I'm Frida Beragon. I'm also not a defendant in this case. That for some reason feels important to say after Beth said it so emphatically. But I'm Liz McAllister's oldest daughter, oldest of 3. And I come to share just a few words from her. She is also in Greene County Detention Facility in Brunswick, Georgia. She's been there she's been incarcerated since April of last year. And we try and talk on the phone about once a week, where she's able to call for about 15 minutes, and we try and pack like all mother-daughter, grandmother, grandchild communication into those 15 minutes once a week. And so I find myself sort of acting as a bridge between her and my small children, who are not quite literate and definitely not very good on the telephone. So she called yesterday. We were on our way to swim lessons, which is the very first world of us to be catapulting down 95 in our minivan on our way to swim lessons, and to have this interjection of a very different reality into the middle of that. So I'll just read briefly from a statement that she wrote. We came to Kings Bay submarine base animated by the absurd conviction that we could make some impact on slowing, if not ending, the mad rush to the devastation of our magnificent planet. This is no extreme overstatement. The 6 Trident submarines at Kings Bay carry enough destructive power to destroy all life on Earth. So what difference can 7 aging activists make? And I'm sure none of the people on this dais would characterize themselves as aging, but my mother did celebrate her 79th birthday in the middle of November in Greene County, and so took that mantle on herself anyway. So what difference can we make? And she says, we come with our voices and our lives. We raise our voices in a cry to dismantle the weapons, all of them. And we risk life and limb and our future hopes to make this plea. Dismantle the weapons. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Ann Grady Flores. I'm sister of Claire Grady in the middle there. I really am so amazed. Just understand, folks, that we pulled this off in 1 week of organizing. So thank you to Helen Young. Where is Helen? Helen is the filmmaker of the film clip, the 15-minute film clip that we're going to watch. And I just want to say that today we were not aware that we were going to have a few extra voices here on the dais. So Helen was very, very generous in giving us a shortened version of the film so we could hear these folks' voices. And also it's important to know that this is the only event that the Kings Bay Plowshares have been able to have because of travel restrictions, because of their ankle monitors. I don't want to say bracelets because that makes it sound too good. But we are so grateful that you folks were able to get permission to travel here for trial prep and that the judge allowed you not to be under house arrest during this prep time. So this is what enabled this day to happen. And also the Holy Spirit. And Helen, and also Jeannine Fletcher. At this point, I'd like Julie Peisier to come up. I wanted to announce we have clipboards that are going to go around the room. We have a global statement of support that is going to be launched for the Kings Bay Plowshares. This statement of support is, it's going to be something where we're asking that the charges be dropped. And we want to make the name of Kings Bay Plowshares and the abolition of nuclear weapons. We want this to be a household name. So this is something for social media. We will put this out on a petition form, but today we're launching it with your signatures. So make sure, we're going to pass the clipboards now. We've got Bill, put your hand up. He's got the clipboards right there. We need 2 more people on this side, if you can have some folks, and we'll move that through. So Julie's going to read the statement right now.
Statement of support for Kings Bay Plowshares 7. The Kings Bay Plowshares 7 are facing trial for having confronted a system in which nuclear weapons that can destroy all creation are accepted as normal, even an inevitable part of life. This threat and the lack of outrage over it led 7 principled activists, Elizabeth McAllister, Stephen Kelly S.J., Martha Hennessy, Claire Grady, Patrick ONeill, Mark Colville, and Carmen Prada, to enter the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia on the 50th anniversary of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. Kings Bay is home port to 6 U.S. nuclear ballistic missile submarines carrying hundreds of nuclear weapons, which each have up to 30 times the explosive power of the bomb that destroyed the city of Hiroshima in 1945. As they acted to embody the prophet Isaiah's biblical command to beat swords into plowshares, the 7 also acted legally to uphold treaties as the supreme law of the land according to the U.S. Constitution, uphold international law manifest in the UN Charter and Nuremberg Principles, and higher moral law on the sanctity of all creation. By their actions at Kings Bay, they sought to draw attention to the urgency of dismantling what Dr. King calls the triple evils, as we rightly emphasize, the triple evils of racism, excessive materialism, and militarism. We who share the moral vision of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7 proclaim our support for their courage and sustained sacrifice, and call for the immediate dismissal of all charges against them.
Okay, this is the fun part. So Frida is going to be our model. We have a social media campaign where we say, I stand with Kings Bay Plowshares to end militarism, racism, and economic exploitation, ##. So we're gonna have these flyers in the hallway or by the tables, and we invite you to take out your cameras and take a picture of yourself and your friends, and then post it on your Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Thank you. Okay, and then the last announcement, or second to last, we've got the 3 folks in prison, in jail down in Brunswick. The only thing that, form of communication that's allowed are these tiny postcards. Where are the postcards? Are they, okay, they're right here on this table. We're gonna pass those out, and there's also addresses on the website, but also in the Catholic Worker newsletter. There's many ways to find it, but you have to follow the instructions or you will get your postcard back, which we've all experienced. All right. So the last thing is we've got a donation, a little tiny tin can, unless somebody wants to loan their hat. And we would love to have everyone generously support the trial efforts. And once again, for Helen Young, I would invite all of you, since we're doing a truncated clip of the film today, I invite you to reach out to Helen. She has information pages right at the front table, so you can connect with her and then have her come and show the film in your communities, to your campuses, and whatever other ways you want to gather your friends.
We must ensure that terrorists never acquire a nuclear weapon. This is the most immediate and extreme threat to global security.
Sister Megan, you've not disputed the fact that you breached security at Oak Ridge.
We don't consider it a breach of security. We were doing what every moral and international law says must be done. The laws of humanity.
You can't go breaking into a federal facility because you believe you're protecting the future of the planet.
We were convinced that we were saving lives.
They cut through fences, breached security.
They made it all the way to the nuclear weapons bunkers. 2 priests, a nun, and 2 fellow activists, all ranging in age from 61 to 84.
We did it to bring to light the illegality and immorality of these weapons.
Blood would not coagulate and ooze through unbroken skin.
This is the Hiroshima bomb. This is the Trident bomb.
It is the most powerful weapon in the possession of human beings today. There's no comparison.
1.6 million fatalities, and about 2.4 million injuries.
Attention must be paid, and it's not being paid.
Amen.
Amen.
It is outrageous that these numbers of weapons and their targeting remain on alert or exist in the world.
This is a historic moment for the international community.
I mission you into the federal penitentiary.
If I would die today, I would feel okay about what I've been trying to do.
Just going to prison is not enough to deter people from speaking the truth about this.
But, just watching this little bit of the film, and I had the great privilege of being able to see the whole film on Monday night up at Brown University. I was struck by the long continuum of plowshares and of anti-nuclear resistance. Since the first plowshares action on September 9th, 1980, there have been more than 100 of these actions, both in the United States and throughout the world. By a count that Art Laffin has done and is working on updating now, more than 35 to 40 of those people have been recidivists, right? Have done more than one of these plowshares actions. And of the Kings Bay 7, 5 of you are recidivists, have done these actions once, twice, and 3 times in the past. Maybe, I think Steve Kelly might have done 4 other plowshares actions. It's one of the reasons he's not here in this room today. And so my first question is, what's different about nuclear resistance in 2019 to when you kind of took your first act as anti-nuclear activists? So what's different today, Patrick?
Me. I failed to tell people before that I'm a father of 8 children. And collectively, the 7 of us have more than 30 children and grandchildren. So our motivation is very much involved with the fact that we have this, these wonderful families. And I think about the fact that my grandchildren will probably be alive in 100 years. And I can't imagine what the world's going to look like in 100 years and how we're going to survive global warming and nuclear weapons. So the reason that we act is to call some attention to that. And I think that it's a very interesting contrast how in the 50s, many of you might remember the air raid drills that the Catholic workers would refuse to participate in Manhattan, and also the drills that we would have in the schools. There was certainly a fear of nuclear weapons back then. Oh, okay. Okay, so there were, we had a real fear of weapons at that time, but really things have changed now. One of the things that we discovered when we went down to South Georgia, where okay, now I'm being told to sit down.
We're going to do a consensus process. All
right, raise your hand if you want me to stand.
People came here in the back, that's all.
Stand away from the film. I'm being told by someone with a camera I'm supposed to sit, so I don't. But anyway, the thing that was fascinating for us is we got down to South Georgia, and we assumed like the group in Tennessee that there'd be a lot of people interested in our case, that it would get a lot of publicity, and maybe we were too proud. But it turned out that we became inconsequential. And the people living in that area, where Jimmy Carter was the person who breathed life into that Trident base, former Navy admiral who brought that big ticket item to South Georgia, people have learned to live with nuclear weapons now as just being a normal part of the landscape. They're no longer an aberration. They're no longer something we need to fear. The government's got everything under control. So what surprised us is that we just didn't have anybody. News media has not been very interested in us. When we have a court hearing, only one little small local paper in Brunswick comes, but they don't cover us. And I do not think it's a media blackout. I think they're just not interested. They don't think it's newsworthy. So I'll tell a quick story about a priest who came to see us in jail. The local priest in St. Mary's, Georgia, came to see us in jail, and he brought us communion, the 4 men and the 3 women separately. And he brought us communion, and he had already, because we knew some people in his parish, he'd already preached against us. He hadn't met us, but he did come for a pastoral visit, which was very loving and kind of him. And he was very formal, kind of a stoic guy, and when he finished up, we thought he was just going to bless us and take off as quickly as possible, but he stayed around, and he asked the 4 of us, he said to the 4 of us, "You guys have caused me some trouble in my parish, because My parishioners are asking me how 7 Catholics can break into the sub-base here and hammer on things and then claim to be doing it in the name of their Catholic faith. And he said, I don't know what to tell them. Literally, he didn't have an answer for that. So he said that, but he listened to us. So for 30 minutes, this priest listens to the 4 of us. Now, Steve Kelly is a Jesuit theologian. He was speaking this man's language, and Steve was very compelling. But he did listen. Only one time in the 30 minutes did he have a disclaimer. He said, I don't even believe in guns. Okay? But after that 30 minutes was up, he completely understood us theologically and politically. So here's the big point, though, is for 4 years at this parish in St. Mary's, Georgia, this priest looked out his rectory window, could see Trident submarines literally floating by in the harbor, and had never given any consideration to the fact that the livelihood and the economy and everything about that community's existence depends on the end of the world. Nobody thought about it, and he hadn't thought about it.
So the question, I think, was what is different now? I think a lot of things have happened since our action that are incredibly significant. Trump pulling out of the INF treaty, and Bolton advising Trump to not respect the Iran nuclear deal, and also Trump's comments about giving fire and fury that has never been seen before. You know, we're being softened up. We're being prepared to accept limited attacks. And also the nuclear posture review, we did study that prior to the action, and it is there that changes are being made to make the nuclear bombs more usable. So I have had the chance to travel to both Iran and to Korea and meet the people there. And when I realized that my country has painted them as evil entities and is willing to eliminate them, I came to a place of having to personally look at my life, my privilege, where I stand in the world, and decide how am I going to proceed with taking personal responsibility for this situation. And it was not an easy discerning process. The people that I'm with are incredible. It's an incredible community, and I don't know what else to say other than this has been the greatest test of my faith.
Good question, Frida. So as we were walking over here, someone said, "What's that church over there?" I said, "Oh, that's St. Paul the Apostle." And the whole corner here reminds me of 1982 with the UN Special Session for Disarmament, when 1 million of us were on the streets in New York saying no to nuclear weapons. So that's just one thing that comes to my mind, how the landscape was different. People were aware of the nuclear weapons and the need to abolish them. And so, but I'm going to sound like a broken record. I think we, with subsequent years and generations, have awakened to the need to attend to some things that we have neglected. And that comes in the form of the triplets. And so what my prayers and my actions and my hope is that we do more integrating, and in the quest and undertaking of that neglected work, that we don't then just drop off nuclear weapons or militarism, but that we do some integrating with all these struggles, that they are all connected.
Is this the right place to stand?
Yes, here.
I just wanted to add the story of the priest that we met down there. The priest was actually from Poland. And at one point in the conversation, he said, you know, the Americans haven't experienced the war, not since the Civil War. And that may sting you momentarily, but actually there's a great truth to that. that we have not been bombed, we have not been invaded in a way that we have bombed and invaded so many other countries, and that so many other countries have experienced. And it may be, in part, that has led to a sort of laziness in our being able to look at nuclear weapons for what they are. Our being able to forgive our own government of the ongoing war crimes, right now, Yemen in particular. In many ways, when we look at some of the documents or the words, the testimonies of Plowshares' actions in the past, the language is in many ways precisely the same. Over and over again, we've been making the same arguments. And a primary argument for us, and I want you all to hear it, because it's the argument that the government doesn't want to hear. The weapons are necessarily illegal. If you derive through international humanitarian law, the weapons are necessarily illegal. We try to repeat that over and over in the court, and it goes no place. In fact, in the court most recently, the judge said, listen, the explosive power of these weapons is not contested. And actually, we should have objected and said, yes, it is contested. Because when we try to bring that up in trial, we will be told we do not have standing. We're not allowed to bring that up. So, my contribution.
So I have time for another round of my own questions. I just want to make sure that this is working, that people can be heard and seen on the camera, that people keep standing up.
It's dark.
Okay. Okay. But they're going to keep standing, because I think it does help everybody pay attention better and really hear, right? Right? Okay, great. So, so my second question to the four of you is, are you afraid? Are you afraid? Each of you are looking at 20, 25 years in prison if the court goes a certain way, and I'd like you to talk about, about the dimension of fear in the action, in the consequences that you're now facing, and how that's impacting your homes and your families and all of that. So a couple of minutes about fear, who maybe is maybe the eighth defendant in this action, or part of what is trying to be vanquished by the action. So so any thoughts on that? Patrick.
For me, the greatest fear was getting ready for the action. And one of the things that's scary is, as you see with Sister Megan and Helen's film, they're going into this area where it's a deadly force zone. And so when we got on the base, we kept hearing this loudspeaker giving this threatening announcement that deadly force is authorized where we were. We're hearing this in the darkness. And so since we split into three groups, which you'll hear more about, Carmen and Liz and Father Kelly, who turned 70 in jail, Frida mentioned that her mom turned 79, they went to that, what would be the comparison to where Sister Megan went in Oak Ridge. It was these bunkers that contained the nuclear weapons. Mark and I went to a shrine where they had nuclear statues, literally, idols. And Claire told you a little bit about what she and Martha did. So what we were worried about was that when Steve and Carmen and Liz went to this zone, this high security zone that had guard towers and guards with guns, and it was very, very quiet around this base at night. There wasn't anybody there. So you could hear a pin drop. And so I was just frightened beyond belief that I was going to hear a gunshot, that they would be, that they'd shoot first and ask questions later. That was my biggest fear. So I remember when we were walking in, and I kept praying that we would pass through the midst of the security, that we would just pass through the midst, which we did, thank God. And then after about a half hour of us just sitting around waiting to be arrested, I see all the police cars heading down the road where Liz and Father Kelly and Carmen were, and I knew they were apprehended, and we didn't hear any gunshots. So that was the greatest fear for me. When we came out of it alive and everybody was healthy, I'm okay. I think I have at this point in the process, now we're waiting close to a year, for this legal process to wind down. Couldn't take much longer because the government is very challenged by this case for a lot of legal reasons I'm not going to go into. But as a father of 8 children, it's my wife that I'm worried about that has to hold down the family in the Catholic Worker House when I go to prison. So I'm not fearful about jail and prison. In fact, I do pretty well there. It's sort of like the Motel 6 to me. I'm kidding.
Well, Dorothy had a really wonderful quote, and I'm not remembering it, but it's about fear and the enemy. So if anyone remembers it, share it with us. The question of fear, I think that our entire culture and way of life relies on fear mongering. And of course this act was very fearful. We need to be delivered from our fear of the enemy, not the enemy itself. And looking at the pictures of dead bodies eliminates my fear. Seeing the effects of the radiation, it's a reality check for me in terms of my life. I've had a very privileged life, and to worry about my own skin and my own future makes no sense when we finally learn what we learn about this weapon and how our country is willing to use these, the only country that has done the first strike and are prepared to do it again. So fear becomes moot.
Good question, Frida. So some years back I realized, what this disarming process and peace seeking is about is learning how to recover our humanity and walk with love, more love and less fear. So that's like a daily thing. But the fear when it came up to this action, we had to, each of us, put our affairs in order. And I'd never done that before. I'd never had this thing of, this is the last time I might see my kids. Or, what should I do with the journals I've kept my entire life? Recycle them now? But the fear, I chose not to go to the bunkers where Carmen, Liz, and Steve went, and I noticed that something was lifted from me in that decision, and I thought, good, I'll get home and see my kids again. That'll be really helpful. I do know that once we got to the base itself on the night of April 4th, April 5th, that I experienced tremendous peace. Tremendous peace. And this place where Kings Bay is has Georgia pines, and there were stars above us, and birds that you could hear, and just like God's peace was what I was feeling. And also a sense like that it's really, we don't know that we're seeking to do God's will and actually don't know entirely what God's will is, but hoping that it's going in some sort of direction towards God's will. And if it is God's will, then it's in God's hands. And it's really not in my hands. And there's some kind of peace that comes with that. And so that's somehow connected to this thing of living with more love and less fear. It's about trusting the Creator. And so being in the jail, I found myself on those little white postcards saying, well, this was Martha, Liz, and I were in a jail cell in the Camden County Jail for the first 5 weeks before being sent to Glynn County, where we were all separated. But I was on the floor next to the toilet, and I said, guys, this is the cushy part. We're all together. We get to do Bible study and prayer together. We get to sing and laugh and enjoy each other's presence, or cry, whatever. But I found my postcards, the writing on these little postcards saying, we're here at the Camden County Jail learning how to live a disarmed life one day at a time. Something like that. So this thing about 25 years, I was in Standing Rock and Dennis Banks called a meeting and he said, remember why you're here. And then he said, and I also want to tell you a story. And he was good with long stories. And he said, he and Russell Means were facing like 150 years. And he said, we both looked at each other and laughed and said, and then life. They were being doped, like given all this crazy thing. He said, they laughed with each other. Which one do you want? Well, take this one and you take that one. And the DA was like, don't laugh, this is serious. That was like not too long before he died. Well, a year or two before he died. And I want to pass that on, like that fear is the main weapon. And that's why we have the good news, because God is greater than all of that. And so, thank you.
My co-defendants are very brave and faithful. I had the bejesus scared out of me when we went on the base into a lethal force zone. In fact, in the court, the prosecution, who'd gotten deeply under my skin, asked me about whether or not I was fearful, and I could not. I went silent for a very long time because I could not think of how to appropriately respond to him, because it was extraordinarily fearful. The only thing I had going for me at that time was I was with Liz McAllister and Steve Kelly. However, I will tell you that when we got there, and when we got as close as we could to the bunkers, and when we were finally sort of apprehended, when the lights finally started going off all over the place, and the first military truck pulled up to greet us, they stopped out in front of us. They waited a long time in the truck. You could barely see them through the window. They waited a long time. A long time was like 3 minutes, but it was a very long 3 minutes. And then they came out of the truck, and when they came out of the truck, the most stunning thing was they were phenomenally young. They were very young. I'm convinced that the two soldiers who confronted us were teenagers. And they did not seem angry at us. They seemed only anxious that they were following the right protocol, that they were doing things right, that they had things right. They had their guns pointed at our feet, and there was a fence separating us, so they couldn't really control us. And they had to wait there until more soldiers came in from behind us. And I will say that the soldiers that were there did treat us. I was ready for. Getting killed is one thing, I suppose, and getting maimed is another. And it was getting maimed that troubled me the most. And as it turned out, that didn't happen. And as it turned out, the exercise they put us through, they had us take 4 steps back, stop. Take 4 steps back, stop. Take 4 steps back, stop. This time they had the guns pointed at us. Then they say, turn around. Then they say, get down on your knees. Then they say, get down on your, lay down. And then they come and you can hear them come, they say, put your hands behind you. And you know you're going to get cuffed. And I thought for sure I would get a knee in the back. I thought for certain. And I didn't. And they didn't put a knee in my back. They cuffed me. And then they told me to roll up into a ball. And then they put me on from my side. They sat me up. And then they lifted me up from behind. So I owe a debt of gratitude to those young soldiers. Just by the way, there were like copious tears shed. We had a long period of formation in the action. And I'm the only one that I don't have a wife and I don't have children. just to say that there were a whole series of episodes where there were copious tears shed for people's concerns about their family. As regards my brave friends, I do want to speak up for those, for our co-defendants who are in jail now for 11 months or nearly 11 months, for people to send them letters, to keep their spirits up, to let them know that they are being cared for, monitored, that there are people who have them on their mind. Because my great enemy in jail, all my fears about jail and fights within jail and fights among the prisoners, none of that came true. Jail was phenomenally boring. And after two, so it got to the point where I didn't want to do anything but sleep. I would sort of sleep away every day, and then realizing that you're no longer living, you're sort of opting out of life. And so I'm very fearful to think about going to jail for years is a fearsome thing. So do keep us in your prayers and write those letters. And when you write those letters, be very meticulous. More than half of the letters, the other inmates were so jealous to see the number of letters that we got. But more than half of the mail that was sent to us did not come to us. So if you write to Liz McAllister, you need to write Elizabeth, not Liz. If you write Liz McAllister, not Elizabeth, they won't deliver the letter.
We can do a whole tutorial after. Just Father Steve Kelly also does not have a wife or children.
But he's fearless.
Even at Fordham, you have to say things like that. So I wonder if one of you would just take a couple minutes and describe your very novel, groundbreaking legal strategy and the motions that you put forward and your hopes or desires for that and kind of what led you to carry out this legal strategy around religious freedom. Is there one of you who'd be willing to speak to that? And maybe just like 3 minutes, so a real nutshell.
The thing that's unique about our strategy is this fascinating decision to use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. If anyone read, if you're a regular reader of the New York Times, you know about the Hobby Lobby case. That was a win based on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's almost an act of law that almost trumps the First Amendment, believe it or not. So it was a great, brilliant idea, and do you remember who thought it up?
Vern.
Vern, okay.
In the shower.
In the shower, one of our lawyers. But anyway, a brilliant lawyer, Vern Walker, here in New York, lives up in Westchester County, a researcher. He's really not a criminal lawyer at all, no criminal experience, but he researched the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and thought, these guys can use this act. They can use it, it applies. And essentially the components of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act are that if you, with sincerely held religious beliefs, do something, okay? Remember the guy who wouldn't bake the cake for the gay couple, for example, right? So it's mostly been used by conservatives, but not only. A Muslim man who wanted to have a beard in prison as part of his religious right, and he won. So we use the Religious Freedom Act in a criminal case. Very different, because mostly it's been used in civil administrative kind of cases. But basically we were allowed to prove whether or not the Religious Freedom Restoration Act applied to our case. So we had to say whether we had sincerely held religious beliefs, we had religious beliefs that were sincerely held, and that there was a burden placed on our religious practice by the government because they did not use the least restrictive means in dealing with us. So keep in mind, we show up in court, and the day we get there, we have 3 felony charges. That's the most restrictive means. when you're facing 3 felony charges and more than 20 years in prison, the government has already decided to use the most restrictive means. So I'm going to use one quick example on what came out thanks to Jeannine Hill Fletcher's testimony. She was one of our expert witnesses in our rights. To use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And one of the questions that was asked to the base commander is, do you have a practice, like if somebody commits a crime on the base, can you do something other than arrest them? And he said, yeah, they can receive what's known as a ban and bar letter. You receive a letter barring you from the base. So we said, well, how many times have you used that ban and bar letter? And he said, oh, maybe a dozen times since I've been the base commander. And so the lawyer, Bill quickly said to him, well, has anybody ever violated that ban and bar letter? And he said, no, it's worked every time. That's interesting because we weren't offered ban and bar letters. But anyway, the problem the government has now is we have filed a motion to have our case dismissed based on the fact that we have sincerely held religious beliefs and that the government has now burdened us. And we're waiting for the government's response. And what the lawyer told us yesterday, Vern Walker, is that the Holy Spirit has hijacked our case. It's one of the nicest things I've heard thus far. The Holy Spirit is like, that's not such a problem. But he's saying that the government really is flummoxed. They're taking a very long time to respond to our motion for dismissal because it's going to create legal precedent. And they don't want legal precedent. And the important thing, if you had watched all of Helen's film, is that Sister Megan and Greg and Michael created legal precedent, which has now taken sabotage out of the equation. We were not charged with sabotage because the legal precedent was that they won and had their case sent back to the lower court because the appellate court said this law out of the Patriot Act of sabotage was not meant for 83-year-old nuns who spray paint. So there's a victory there. The government doesn't want a bunch of Catholic pacifists to get off on any grounds, any moral grounds, because it would not bode well for the future. Now we argue international law, we argue necessity defense. What you know is the burning building defense. I go by your house and it's on fire and I break the door down. Sister Megan referenced it. And I don't get arrested for burglary. There's already precedent against us on those points. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is novel, new, and it would be very interesting to see where it goes. So we're just waiting patiently. Although we talked to Mark Colville today on a speakerphone, and he's not waiting patiently.
So I think now is the time to open it up for questions from the audience. I wasn't briefed on the use of microphones and all of that for this period. Is there going to be a mic here? There should have been. Oh, I'm not giving this one up though. Okay, and so if you have a question for the 4 defendants, please line up at the mic. And if you line up, yeah, just line up there. And while that's happening, I will ask, do we have until 4 o'clock?
Yes. And Frida, people should come around because of the cameras.
Oh yes, we're being mindful of the cameras here. Just don't step on the incredibly well-behaved 6-year-old who's in the front here.
Seamus.
He's mine. That's why he's so well-behaved. Okay.
First of all, thank you for your courage. It's a great witness. Well, I wanted to know, as citizen activists, is there someone in Congress who champions this? Is there somebody we could pressure? My congressman is Engel. I know he's got some position now. In other words, what could we do as citizens to get rid of these weapons? And is there anyone, particularly if there's congresswoman or man so-and-so who could bring a hearing, we could get our congresspeople to tell them, make sure the hearing happens. In other words, actions we could take. Thank you.
It is exceptional what we did, and we would just say for all of you to do, it's not up to us to say what you should do. You have your own discernment process to understand what you can do. I think that the Washington Senator Adam Smith is the chair of the Armed Services Committee. I think if you get in touch with him, that might be a good thing because he needs to hear from the citizens. I actually believe that everyone knows we're against these weapons. The majority of the citizens are against them, and they don't care. So we do need to figure out a strategy of economic base that I think is what is needed for defunding the nuclear system.
I think the person who could best answer that question is William Hartung, who's the next questionnaire. He's the person who really understands the military-industrial complex better than anyone. And really, there's almost no one that contradicts the military-industrial complex. So maybe you would want to answer the question and then ask your own.
My wife told me if I came, Carmen was going to ask me to speak.
Yes.
So I was forewarned. I think you're right about Adam Smith. I think, members of Congress, they get money from the contractors, they're worried about jobs in their district, they buy into a lot of this nuclear argumentation about how somehow these things are protecting us and we can only go so low. So they need to hear from us early and often. But I think he's done a few things, like he wants to block the new, quote, usable nuclear weapon. He's questioned why we're spending so much. So he needs to be pushed further. And on another issue, on Yemen, blocking U.S. support for the terrible Saudi war there, he was kind of, harumphing. He wasn't really on our side. Then he was primaried from the left. Suddenly he signed on to the bill. He was co-sponsor. He was speaking out. So I think there is a role for citizen protest in pushing these folks. But I will say what you all have done, as Carmen mentioned, when he was deciding whether to do it, when you see somebody with that courage, you feel like, well, I have to do something. Maybe I'm not courageous enough to do what you've done, but I have to do everything I can using my skills, my contacts, my network. And I think that's what we have to communicate to people, that there's things they can do short of risking felony prosecution that will make a huge difference. And I think what you're doing is inspiring that, opening that possibility. So somewhere I had a question, but Carmen set me off course. Oh, well, Helen's film, which everybody should try to see all of, you notice that the media coverage was all about protecting the weapons, not protecting people. How did an 83-year-old nun get into this and using box cutters and so forth, and all those Republican members of Congress thanking her for showing us how vulnerable our weapons are. So getting the message about how actually it's about the weapons annihilating us, not about us protecting the weapons. I think this kind of action does that. I think Helen's film does that. And I think it's really that simple. And so sometimes when we get into our arguments, we buy into the logic of the other side, that somehow there's some greater proof that we need. So I guess that wasn't the question, but anyway, thanks for what you're doing.
Is this, you can hear me, right? Okay, my question is about you're facing possibly this long prison sentence. And I'm not familiar, I don't know well everybody who's a participant in this action, but I did participate in the Yemen Vigil every Saturday with Catholic Worker. And so this is really directed more to Carmen, who I got to know through that. And my concern is that, and I mention him because I think particularly as a gift, he has a voice, he has a communication capacity to break down a lot of this confusing, contradictory information and data and total bullshit we get all the time, to help people understand. He has a passion to inspire people to be active. What's going to happen when that voice is incarcerated? There is a history of, I'm hoping it's not, but if the possibility is there, there are histories of political prisoners continuing dialogue and having a voice while incarcerated. And I think it's, if that can happen, this action will take roots and it will help all of us because I'm not Catholic, so I'm looking at the here and now, and I'm getting older, and I'd like to see, so I like to have people that can speak up and organize us to be there. So have you thought about how you will use your voice if you are incarcerated?
Thus far, my experience of having been incarcerated would entirely squelch your voice. But that is because I'm in jail and not in prison. And I do think, so in jail, the only thing that people can write back to you when you send them those postcards is a postcard the same size that they have to write back to you. If you're in a more settled situation in prison, my understanding is you can actually write letters. That if you have a support community, and we have an excellent support community, and you can all join it, you could also get newspapers and magazines and books to read in jail. I don't think there's any real question that being in jail is going to obscure things for almost anyone. There are a lot of good communicators in our community, and I don't know what more to. Yeah, it's one of the things we argued via the RFRA defense is that the burden on our religious beliefs, on our religious practice, is to be taken out of the game, is to be taken out of the War Resistance League and the Catholic Worker and those organizations that are fighting against war. Because that is our faith motivation actually brings us to those very places. And it'll be interesting to see if the government can actually sincerely respond to that, and I think they have no thought of it, really. But it is interesting that there's a law that sort of projects it at them. Can they actually think of us as human beings? Can they actually think that we are not criminals? Can they actually get it through their heads that the weapons are illegal?
Hi, I'm glad we just brought up the point about the military-industrial complex as its own kind of perpetual motion machine. This has provided a vindicating perspective, totally opposite from what I had growing up as a kid. My mother is a U.S. Admiral and a military attaché for the Department of Homeland Security, so we have a complicated relationship. And the story that she likes to tell about the military-industrial complex, because she handles reappropriations for research and development in the Coast Guard, is that senators will come to her and say, we've allocated so many billions of dollars for the Coast Guard, and that's way more than the Coast Guard needs. But if any of these senators were caught lowering the military budget, not only would the contractors be disappointed, but they'd lose 40% of their constituency. So beyond the actual financial vicissitudes of the military-industrial complex, how do we get beyond this affective blindness on the part of so many members of the American electorate so that they literally cannot imagine themselves beyond a neoliberal social system enforced by continuous military spectacle?
I'm not smart enough to answer that question.
Who is the person who asked the question of Carmen? What's your name again?
Tracy.
Tracy, I feel like this person just answered your question in some way about people emerging and appearing and standing up and bringing what they need to organize and inspire and transform the systems that are so normalized and so seductive, right? I actually don't have one answer, and I believe really strongly that there isn't one answer for anything, but that I do feel really strongly though that if each of us do something that is from our heart and our conscience, and that if we do them collectively, that the possibilities are way bigger than we imagine, right? So these kind of nonviolent symbolic actions are not strategy sessions on how to deal with Congress people or how to deal with this electorate sessions, but in my lifetime what I've experienced is sort of like, all right, if you you come together as a community, you plan to do something that's real and truthful, and then it kind of goes up into the universe, and then everyone who resonates with that can take the energy from that action and run with it in the way that they're feeling called to do it. So I think you have the answers for what you just said, and but just the way that you asked it was energizing. So I want to give you that feedback and keep going with that.
Let's not forget the philosophy of Peter Martin and Dorothy Day about voluntary poverty and our standard of living. I mean, we are all earning money that is not seen anywhere else in the world, and we are paying war taxes that keep this machine going. So let's look at the economics of it in terms of whether we want to self-sacrifice in a way that doesn't allow this to continue.
For myself, I find the shortest answer to your question is to watch Democracy Now! FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his definition of fascism was the merger between corporations and the state. And that's what Democracy Now! Avoids. Democracy Now! Is its own entity. It's not run by corporations. MSNBC is the Fox News for the Democratic Party.
Right, yeah.
So
right.
That's my short answer to it.
Right.
Anybody else along
here? Hi. First of all, my name is Lisa, and I work with the 9/11 Truth Action Project in New York. And I support, I congratulate the personal sacrifice and the personal, what it takes to do, what you've done. And I believe it was, I'm terrible with names, in the red, when you was talking about how that years ago, there was millions here in New York, against nuclear weapons. Well, it was you that, okay. So I believe that can happen again. I know it can happen. And what I feel is that that there are things already going on in addition that would give us hope.
I just want to say thank you to everybody who did these events, and then whoever's going to do it in the future. Meeting a hero is very rare. A hero to me is someone with courage. It's not worried about what anybody thinks. I really value what you said about the courage, what you went through to do this, and whatever was going to happen, you did it. Most people would never do what you did. Just wanted to say thank you, and let's remember Mumia Abu-Jamal, who the DA just screwed over, and people on the left thought was a great guy, and he's appealing Mumia's decision. The lawyers.
We only have a couple of minutes left for questions, and so I really want to encourage people to ask questions for the defendants. So we'll have some time afterwards to mingle. We can share information. There's a lot of people here who have information to share, but let's take the little bit of time that we have in this public forum for questions.
Joel Kupferman from the National Lawyers Guild. The Guild is here to support you in court, outside of court, and everyone's right to demonstrate. But also just want to, I guess it's a leading question here, is that we should focus our anti-nuke actions in New York and elsewhere. Right now the Senate and Assembly is voting for clean energy standards. Though clean energy considers nuke plants to be safe. Well, that's one thing we have to change here, and I think that's part of the whole mistake of putting nukes up there. The other is that I think it's important to recognize the indigenous nations that are suffering from uranium production and the like, and I think that's one way for us to grow. And maybe the question is, how can we do that?
Any responses to Joel's question? Thank you, Joel.
Joel, thank you. And the last thing that you bring up is something that we're grateful to attend to. It comes up in our statement that it's indigenous people who are, well, out the way it kind of comes to me, who's been on the front line of empire's weapons and waste from the beginning, right? And so we're grateful to become connected more in relationship with people or indigenous organizers. So there's a group in New Mexico called the Nuclear Issues Study Group, and they had a conference in December of 2017 called Dismantling the Nuclear Beast, and you can find it online. There's tons of YouTube footage that is like a handbook for grassroots organizing. Just all the different ways that the nuclear beast exists and the grassroots efforts to dismantle it. And the indigenous people have been on the front line for that resistance. Where I live in Haudenosaunee territory, up in the Finger Lakes, there's Seneca people live with the dumping of nuclear waste, and there's indigenous organizers that we've been in relationships with some years now. Agnes William and Maria Maybe are two of them. And yeah, that's where we will get some guidance and heal those relationships. Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the things that we've noticed in this work for peace is, and many of you have noticed it, is that it seems like there's no tolerance for dissent in this country anymore.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we can do to help change the course of things is to dissent. And one of the arguments that we made orally in our motion to dismiss is, I said to the judge, Your Honor, after 9/11, our government ceased to be a democracy because all three branches of government march in lockstep in support of nuclear weapons and endless war. There's no checks and balances happening. It's really only us, the anti-war people, who are offering any dissent to this government. So I said, our charges should be dismissed because we're performing a public service in opposing. Keep in mind that Donald Trump's war budget last year passed the Senate 93-7. So Democrats and Republicans are very, very much united when it comes to war and nuclear weapons. We have to dissent to that.
Thank you.
I'm a librarian by profession. Please come to the Quinn Library. It's a pretty peaceful place when you have the chance. I want to thank all of you for your courage and dedication to doing this. Quick comment, and then I'll pose my question. My father was a chopper pilot in the Vietnam War. It's about half a century ago. And it really dismays me, to put it politely, that after all the sacrifices of our veterans in fighting what they hoped would be America's last war, that we're now lavishing the Pentagon with $700 billion plus. I mean, it's unthinkable. So I guess my question to all of you is, do any of you have relatives and or friends who fought in a war of any kind, recent times or not, which has influenced your own stance on weapons and war making? Thank you.
Thank you for that. My brother was in Vietnam as a 20-year-old when I was 14. And he did a 9-month tour of duty. And Dorothy approached him about considering conscientious objector status. And he said no. And she respected that. Privacy of conscience is first and foremost for any of us. And, you know, I was a kid, and we were in the streets protesting the Vietnam War here in New York, 1969. And it was not theoretical when he walked out the kitchen door on his way to Vietnam. It was very real. And of course, I had spent my entire life hearing that war was wrong, that war made no sense whatsoever. So I had the theoretical background, and then when Eric walked out the door, it became a real reality. And I didn't know whether I would ever see him again. And that experience, that very personal experience, was something that was overpowered my sense of this kind of experience. And then my trip to Korea, just learning about what we did to that country, just absolutely overwhelming.
maybe I could use this. My brother Richie is a colonel in the U.S. Army, and we don't agree on much politically. And he was the chief American medic at Bagram in Afghanistan, and from my perspective, Bagram was worse than Guantanamo. The torture at Bagram was worse than what went on at Guantanamo. That said, after this action, my brother who lives in North Carolina decided to come visit me in prison, and I heard this was going to happen, and I didn't know if he was going to read me the riot act when he got there. But of course he did not, and he was just concerned to see that I was well. So it was kind of a beautiful visit on my brother's part. So.
My father was a veteran of the Korean War in the Navy, but he was killed in a construction accident in Manhattan in 1960, so I was too young to ever talk with him about the war. But my mother, having been exposed at the age of 23 to the loss of her husband, she had two preschool-age sons, myself and my younger brother. Those of us who remember watching the TV news during the Vietnam War when they would have the two clickers every day. How many people died today? Only American soldiers. And how many had died in the course of the war? And the numbers went up every day. And then we had all that footage from the war before the Pentagon stopped allowing the war to be shown on TV. And my mother would always say to my brother and I, as we were getting older and the war was prolonged, that if you boys get old enough to be drafted, we're going to Canada. She didn't want to lose her two sons, and I understood that. And that kind of gave me certainly a curiosity about why did my mother oppose war. She planted a nice foundation there. And then I started hanging out with Frida's dad. And he's responsible for where I am today.
Justin Callister's husband was a field-decorated lieutenant in World War II. He was drafted as a young man. And many of his brothers, I think 4 of the 6 brothers, all served in that war.
Rosemary Pace from Pax Christi. I'm just curious with everything I've heard, which is all totally informative and inspiring, etc., how it is that nobody's mentioned the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons yet. So just curious to know about that.
Does anybody want to mention it? Or Rosemary, do you want to come back and mention it in more detail?
This is a treaty that was, I don't know what they approved, what the correct word is, September 20th in 2017, I guess now. And actually July 7th. But as of September 20th, nations were able to start signing and ratifying it. And it's a very comprehensive treaty that does what it says, prohibits nuclear weapons, the preparation for nuclear weapons, the mining of the uranium, other countries having the right to even have nuclear weapons. For example, the US has nuclear weapons in other countries. You know, we're all over the place in the wrong way. But it's just a treaty that was celebrated by the likes of Megan, and it was that week that we first saw the whole film of the nuns, the priests, and the bomb at the UN. And there were celebrations, and it was just wonderful. And on September 20th, the Vatican was, I'm from a Catholic organization, the Vatican was one of the first signers and ratifiers of the treaty, along with, I forget how many signed that very first day. I think they're up to, they need 50 to ratify. They've got 19 that have ratified, and I know more than that have signed, way more than that have signed. So, of course, the US and the other nuclear nations immediately said they would have nothing to do with this. So when people ask what can we do, one of my thoughts is we've got to chip away at Congress and at our own citizenry to keep saying this treaty, this treaty, this treaty, and absolutely demanding that we break down this resistance of our nuclear nation. So again, I'm just curious to know how it is that we got this far and it hasn't been mentioned.
I think when it was first reported on, it was very underreported as well in July of 2017.
Rosemary, at one point I thought Martha was going to talk about it, and anyway, I didn't grab the microphone, but we would be remiss if we left here today and didn't talk about it. So thank God the Spirit is in charge. But just a word about that, that treaty it comes from such a grassroots place, right? It's an unenforceable treaty. It's a grassroots upheld treaty, and it employs all the nonviolent tools that are at our disposal. And yes, not only Sister Megan, but many people that are doing Plowshares actions are working at that grassroots level to support and encourage that treaty. So thank you for bringing it before we leave together.
Hi, I'm Marianne, Claire's sister. I was wondering whether one of you would answer. I have three things. One is, can somebody speak to the fact that Plowshares is not only a Catholic movement? And the other thing is, can you talk about, I think Claire, you might address this, about how this is invitational and not, it's kind of like 12 steps. Yes. And then the third thing is, would you agree that one of the ways that we citizenry can most easily support pulling out of nuclear weapons is to divest? So right here and in the hallway, and I've got to pull out the rest of the file, we've got a copy of a divestment campaign that's being run by Code Pink and World Beyond War, with David Swanson, Roots Action. Many of you probably know of them. Anyway, this is a very hands-on thing, and I think about it, how it moves back to supporting First Nation peoples who are at the brunt of this whole mining and dumping and contamination. So I'd invite everybody to pick up a copy of this. But if you guys could answer that and maybe speak to divestment. For example, Lockheed Martin and Boeing they're the ones that produce the D5 Trident nuclear missiles. Anyway, thank you.
If you want to do a Plowshare action, see me, Bill Moyers, after this, okay? Privately in the back.
Other responses to that, to Marianne's intervention there? Clear invitation.
One thing that comes up is that as God planned it, I'm one of 5 siblings in my family, and that we all 5 live in the same town in Ithaca, and that most of the time when I'm speaking at a church or whatever, that we're a team. And so I usually toss the ball to the practical parts of ICANN, for instance, and the divestment effort. So that's what you're seeing Rosemary do, is that I'm usually like, okay, I'll do this part, but I don't have to do the whole thing, right? So that's what you're seeing here. Marianne is tireless with championing those aspects and working in our town on a grassroots level with our local legislators and people to do that very practical thing of divesting. And the second thing Marianne asked about was this invitational, you used the word invitational, and I guess that goes back to our 12-step work, which talks about attraction rather than promotion. So maybe I've already touched on that in saying that when we each do something that we feel called to do, we trust that if it resonates with you, or to the extent that it does, that you go forward with how you want to do it. But we can say in that 100 different Plowshares actions that I don't know how many of them have been all Catholics, but I think it's not even half have been all Catholics. We're kind of an extraordinary group that all 7 of us are Catholic. But I do know some that were completely not Catholic, and I do know some that were mixed. And anyway, there's room for everybody and room to make it how you want to do it. But the part that feels like basic is that there's this piece of non-compliance and withdrawing consent. So these weapons exist in our name, with our money, on our behalf, until we demonstrate and manifest some withdrawal of our consent. My sister said, about to chew the microphone.
No. Thank you, Claire. Last question from Bill Pickard.
In 1983, the Catholic Bishop wrote a statement on peace, and that's been standing there for a long time. The Vatican Council talked about weapons of mass destruction had to be eliminated. But the problem is institutions had not got behind it. Universities, bishop conferences, anything like this. So it seems that we can't move the ball down court without really taking a risk and becoming out of step with the institutional community. And I think we have to be prophetic about this. We have to demand that our bishops and universities begin to take stands, right up to the board of these institutional directors. That's what has to go.
Amen. Thank you. We are pretty much out of time, and I want to give the last word to the defendants. I want to give the last word to the defendants, so I'm going to ask you to be very quick.
Okay. I'm Sister Megan Rice's first cousin. My name is Megan Hook Shoreless. Her two grandniece and nephew and grandniece and nephew are sitting with me. And I want to read one thing. She mailed me the 6-page pamphlet. I received it at 4 p.m. last night to make up turnout. No, it's 6 pages. So everybody, nuclearban.us, the treaty compliance campaign. Now I'll try to ask Helen Young or someone here to give me email addresses. I can copy it and send it out. But I didn't really want to speak. My father's Walter Hook, who you saw very briefly, who was at Nagasaki helping clean up. So yes, I have a military father also, and he was Megan's uncle. And love and peace, I think it's the best way to end this. I wish there was more love and some more peace. So, anyway, thank you everybody for doing this. There her grandson.
Thank you. I want to end with asking each of you to, in about 5 words or less, say what you hope to change, through the Kings Bay Plowshares, through your witness, through your lives. 5 words.
Love is the only rational act.
You would love to wake everyone up to the love of God.
Well, as the Holy Spirit gave it to me in the jail cell once, this is more than 5 words. But to the extent that those of us of privilege take responsibility for the big crime of killing millions and stealing trillions, we'll stop scapegoating those on the receiving end of those crimes.
I don't want to waste time. I'd have to think too long about it. One thing I would say is there's one part of me that is extraordinarily optimistic. And it is every time of crisis, right, is a time of opportunity. And so we're in an enormous crisis. I mean, there's an entire generation looking at climate change, looking at this nuclear dilemma. The reports, Watch Democracy Now, right? We got, in the next 12 years, does creation just walk away from us? So and I do think so. There are movements to take down the statues in the South, the Confederate statues in the South, to take down the statue here in New York City of Columbus. So America is actually beginning to understand itself. The American people, in many ways, are beginning to understand what their history has actually become about. So let us grow. Let us grow. Let us grow. Let our democracy grow. And Peace is the rational option. And I do think that there is a good subset of the American people that is quite rational, and I'm very hopeful about that.
So Frida ended this program at 4, and I'm going to go 1.5 minute more. It's a Grady thing. Anyway, so I just wanted to remind people, Ellen, hold your fingers up, or your papers up. We've got a few of these sheets, and we'd like you to take your cameras and oh, Jeannine has another one right in the back. So we need people to do your homework now. We've got an hour left to be in the room. So please take your postcards. We've got newsletters that have the addresses. We have the addresses written out. If you want to pull out your phones and take photos of those addresses, you can do it that way. But we encourage you to take your photos and also take your homework home and look at the divestment sheets and then the newsletters. Thank you all for coming. This has been a miracle. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Jeannine.